Last week, we saw the first half of Luke 19, where Jesus had an encounter with Zacchaeus in Jericho, a place of new beginnings. And this week, we're going to continue and finish the rest of Luke 19. And we're going to see Jesus leaving Jericho for Jerusalem. And so if you have your Bible with me, turn to Luke 19:28 to 48. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Luke 19:28 to 48. After telling the story, Jesus went on toward Jerusalem, walking ahead of his disciples. And as he came to the towns of Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives, he sent two disciples ahead. Go into that village over there, he told them. As you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, why are you untying that coat, just say, the Lord needs it. So they went and found the coat just as Jesus had said. And sure enough, as they were untying it, the owners asked them, why are you untying that coat? And the disciples simply replied, the Lord needs it. So they brought the coat to Jesus and threw their garments over it for him to ride on. As he rode along, the crowd spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles they had seen. Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. But some of the Pharisees among the crowd said, Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that. He replied, if they keep quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers. But as he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city ahead, he began to weep. How I wish today that you of all people would understand the way to peace. But now it is too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you to the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you. Then Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people selling animals for sacrifices. He said to them, the scriptures declare, my temple will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. After that he taught daily in the temple, but the leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the other leaders of the people began planning how to kill him. But they could think of nothing because all the people hung on every word he said. Jesus leaves Jericho and he's heading to Jerusalem. And as he goes toward Jerusalem from Jericho, he's going to pass through Bethany and Bethphage, two small villages or towns not far from Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. Bethany is about only a small village of 20 homes. It's on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And when you leave Jerusalem to go out east, the last place you're going to be in is Bethany or Bethphage before you hit the Judean wilderness. Bethany is 2 miles from Jerusalem, about a 45-minute walk. And it's like I said, on the far side of the Mount of Olives. It's out of sight and away from the hustle and bustle of Jerusalem. So Jesus, whenever he visited Jerusalem, liked to stay in Bethany with some of his closest friends. Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived in Bethany. And so whenever Jesus came to Jerusalem, he would stay with them. He would go during the day to Jerusalem, and then he would come back in the evening and join them. So this was a home away from home for him, a place that he was comfortable in. In the neighboring town of Bethphage was also on the Mount of Olives. And on Palm Sunday, Jesus leaves Bethany after he has come from Jericho to Bethany. He leaves Bethany and he goes towards Bethphage. And on the way, he asked two of his disciples He sends them ahead of him and he says, go into the town and you will find a donkey's colt, a young donkey, tied there. And when you come to that young donkey, untie it and bring it to me. If anybody asks you who told you to do this, tell them that I did. And so they go and they find the donkey as it is, as Jesus said, where Jesus said it was going to be. Eventually, they would go down, go to the Mount of Olives, and then go down the Kidron Valley, and then they would have to travel up to Jerusalem, where the temple was. Now, this request of a donkey is kind of strange, right? Why does Jesus ask his disciples to go and take some stranger's donkey and bring it to him? And even stranger still, it seems that the owner asked them who wants it, and when they say Jesus needs it, he's happy to send the donkey with them. He doesn't ask any more questions. Now, animals were part of the people's wealth, or whatever they owned was what they made money out of. And there are plenty of donkeys in Israel still to this day. I took a picture of this while I was in Israel. But most people were not very well off, right? They were fairly poor in these small villages. Having a donkey was a big deal. So why would they just send the donkey away without knowing who it's going to or whatever? Maybe they knew who Jesus was. Maybe they'd heard of him. Bethany was a neighboring town. Maybe they knew Mary and Martha and that Jesus had visited them several times. Maybe they had even gone there to hear him teach. Maybe they had even witnessed Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead in Bethany. We don't know. Luke doesn't explain what the reasons are, but they were willing to give up their donkey for Jesus' need. But why does Jesus want a donkey? Why does he want to ride a donkey to Jerusalem? Why not a horse? Why not walk like he always did? What is the significance of this donkey? It was in fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy from Zechariah. Zechariah 9:9 says, rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt. So Jesus is fulfilling this Old Testament prophecy about him. And as you can see, there are people in Israel to this day riding donkeys, right? This young boy was riding a donkey and keeping his goats. He's a goat herder in Israel. So it's not an unusual sight for someone to ride a donkey. But it is for Jesus to ride a donkey into Jerusalem, because he is fulfilling prophecy. It's very meaningful. People would have thought of that prophecy when they saw him on a donkey. The donkey is brought, and Jesus' disciples place their garments over the back of this donkey, probably their outer cloak. And then as he begins to ride, the people, the crowds that had gathered, they begin to throw their garments in front of him as he comes along. Sort of like how what people would do for a king or a queen, right? We've heard of stories in the Middle Ages and stuff when a king or a queen was walking and there was a puddle on the ground. Somebody whisks off their cloak and throws it on the ground to cover the puddle so that the king can walk over it and not get his feet dirty. So this is an idea of a king or a queen. They're honoring someone like a king, right? And Jesus reaches up to the Mount of Olives. He rides up with the donkey, reaches on the top of the Mount of Olives. And as the people come behind him and they reach up, they get their first glimpse, their first vista of Jerusalem in the distance. If you go up to Mount of Olives, I was standing here on the top of Mount of Olives. Behind me is the Kidron Valley, drops down to the Kidron Valley, and then it goes up again. And in the horizon, you can see the city of Jerusalem laid out before you. From the Mount of Olives, it's just across, right? Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful city. And they would have seen the city walls of Jerusalem. They would have seen the Temple Mount would be visible on Mount Moriah. And on top of that would stand the beautiful temple. Now, of course, it's replaced by the golden mosque by the Muslims. But during Jesus' time, they would have seen the temple across. Mm-hmm. And immediately the crowd begins to shout and praise God and sing. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Verse 38. It just bursts out of their mouth, right? The sight of Jerusalem, the holy city. In Matthew's gospel, he tells us that they're waving palm branches. And they call him Son of David. The reason for this is because of a significance that an Old Testament event has to what Jesus is doing. This is found in 1 Kings 1. King David was getting pretty old, and one of his sons, Adonijah, decides to take away some of the people from their loyalty to King David onto himself. And he wants to be the king after David. And so some of them take him, intending to anoint him as king behind David's back. And they take him to a place called En Rogel. The blue star marks the place where En Rogel is situated. It is at the junction of the Hinnom and the Kidron Valley where they meet together and come to a point. That's where En Rogel is. And they intended to take him there and anoint him as king. Meanwhile, Bathsheba and Nathan hear about this plot, Nathan the prophet, and they go and tell the king. This is what they're planning to do. Immediately, King David says, bring Solomon, take some of my men, and put him on my mule, his donkey, right? And he commissions Nathan the prophet and Zadok the priest to take a bunch of people with them, David's servants, and this placing Solomon on the mule, take him to Gihon. Gihon springs are at the bottom of the Kidron Valley, right? Before you go up to the Temple Mount. So they would have come from Jerusalem down into the valley, Kidron Valley, and at the bottom was the Gihon Springs. And there they anoint him king. And they blow the trumpet, the shofar, and they shout, long live King Solomon, long live King Solomon. This story is found in 1 Kings 1, 33 and 34. And the similarity of this story, what happened to Solomon, and what Jesus is doing, the significance of Jesus' actions, make it seem like it's a coronation, right? Here, both of them, both Solomon and Jesus, both were riding on a donkey. And both of them take the same path down to the Kidron Valley. And they're shouting by the crowd, calling him king. The crowd's response to Jesus is like this was the coronation of Jesus as King of Israel. Here's this Davidic king riding to Jerusalem, they were hoping that he would free them from Roman rule and once again set Israel as an independent country of its own with a king of its own. Mm-hmm. This was their expectation, that he would usher in the rule of the royal Messiah, and they're acting on it. Now the Pharisees who were in the crowd, they object. They don't recognize Jesus as either Messiah or king. Right. And so they kind of scold Jesus and say, why don't you rebuke these people for what they're saying to you? Mm-hmm. And Jesus says, well, if they don't, then the stones themselves will shout praises. They will begin to cheer. And so Jesus is making his identity as the Messianic King very clear here. This is his moment, his triumphal entry, announcing the arrival of Israel's long-awaited Messiah, Israel's King. Now, there's always been an understanding in Israel that God is the ultimate King of Israel. Even Saul and David and Solomon, they all recognized that they were there just to do God's will, that God was the ultimate King of Israel. Jesus and the crowd crest to the top of Mount of Olives. And Jerusalem, of course, is seen clearly from there. Across, below them is the Kidron Valley. Across them is the city of God, the golden city, the holy city of Jerusalem. They can see the Temple Mount. It's visible on top of Mount Moriah. And one would expect that Jesus would be celebrating, right, with the crowd shouting and everything. Instead, there's a very different response we hear from Jesus. He begins to weep. And in the place that he weeps, on top of the Mount of Olives, it's been marked by a church that is built in that place. And in this church, in the back of this church is a big window. And through this window, you can see the city of Jerusalem. You can see the Temple Mount. And for them, they would have seen the temple. But for us, it's the Golden Mosque that's visible through that window. And at the base of this window, there's an altar there. And in the front of the altar is a mosaic of a chicken with its chicks under its wings. Now, the place where Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, when he comes to the Mount of Olives, he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers. How often I've wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks under her wings. But you would not let me." Jesus mourns over those who are unrepentant, those who did not accept him as Messiah, as King, and also those who reject his message of salvation. And verse 42, Jesus expresses that wish. Look, I wish you had understood that way to peace, but you didn't. And now it's too late, he says. You will face judgment. See, they trusted in the city of God. They trusted in the temple of God more than they trusted in God himself. And now Jesus prophesies that both the city and the temple will be destroyed. Their enemies would come against them, build ramparts against the city walls, and the walls of Jerusalem will be breached, and not a single stone will be left standing. This is a rampart, the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And here, this is not the city, but this is Masada, which is a stronghold. It's up on a top of a huge hill and was considered to be impenetrable. There's a fort up on top of Masada. Walls were high. It was easy to see any enemy that approaches, and they would kill them from the top. But even Masada was the Romans came and laid siege on Masada. And what they do is they build this siege ramp. You can see the siege ramp in the picture that takes them right up the walls. And then they would have a battering ram, big log of wood or something, and that they would ram the walls until the stones become weakened and they fall. Once the wall's been breached, then they can enter into the city, and of course they would take the city. They would kill the people. It happened at Masada, and it happened at Jerusalem too. Jerusalem, Jesus' prophecy about Jerusalem came true in 70 AD when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, as well as the temple was destroyed. The walls were gone, all the stones, not a single stone was left standing. And some of the stones have been reused in building projects over the years, but you can still see some of the stones at the base of the southern wall and the western wall in the corner there. You can still see it today. This is the southern wall, and there would have been a gate there through which people would enter. You see the southern steps on which people are gathered and they're worshiping. There was a tour group that came by. But these are the southern steps through which Jesus would enter into the temple that day. So people coming, Jews from all over the world, Jews from all over the world still come on pilgrimage to mourn the loss of their temple to this day. And they come to the Wailing Wall and they mourn the loss. And This is called the Wailing Wall because of that. The Western Wall is called the Wailing Wall because of their loss of their temple was so big to them. This particular day when we came there, they were commemorating the victory after the 6-day war and Israel's independence. Israel became a nation that day. And so they were expecting President Netanyahu to come and give a speech, and the media was gathered there. There were crowds of people all over, and we got to see it on that historic day of celebration in Israel. But this is the Wailing Wall that they would go to. And Jesus' triumphal entry is on Palm Sunday. So the path that he traced was Bethany, Bethphage, up the Mount of Olives, down through the Kidron Valley, and then up again to Mount Moriah. And he would have entered through the southern gates, through the southern steps, and into the temple. And that's where he first went, to the temple. Thank you. Jesus enters Jerusalem and goes straight to the temple. And he sees people selling animals for sacrifice. Now the temple is supposed to be a place of God's presence, of prayer and of worship, right? And here they were using it for business reasons. They were selling animals for sacrifice, and Jesus is filled with a righteous anger. And he overturns the tables of the money changers. He drives out the people who were using the temple for business and money making. And he says, and he quotes from Isaiah 56:7 and Jeremiah 7:11. My house is a house of prayer for all peoples, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. Now, in the entry to the western wall, there's a pillar with that's painted, and this Isaiah 56:7 is inscribed on it. Now, even now, if you go there, you'll see it. And even now, the people of Israel, the Jews, the faithful Jews, consider the temple as a house of prayer for all peoples. And when they go in there, they're reminded again and again that they've lost that temple. They've lost that place of worship. And they long for that, and which is why they wail and they pray. The pilgrims from all over the world gather there to pray and petition God. Mm-hmm. And they write down their prayers in small pieces of paper, and they roll it up, and they put it in the crevices between the stones of the western wall. That's the only place they have access to, the only place that's remaining a part of the temple, the outside wall of the temple. And Jesus clears the temple that day, and he begins to teach at the temple every day from then on. Now, for those who tend to think that Jesus, the New Testament God, is meek and mild, Jesus' temple actions that day was not that of a mild man of peace, was it? Mm-hmm. It was certainly a provocative action, and intentionally so. He's throwing down the gauntlet. And by doing so, he's angered the leaders of the temple, the chief priests, and the leading priests, the leaders, the religious leaders of the day. And they begin to plot and plan to kill him. They want to do away with him. Now, they couldn't get him that day because the crowd was hanging on every word of Jesus. But there would come a day when they would figure out a way to kill him. We've seen Jesus' triumphant entry. Pretty dramatic, right? And the prophecy about him being fulfilled on Palm Sunday. But people have rejected their Messiah. They eventually reject the salvation that he offers. Instead, they place their trust in the temple of God and in the city of God. And they plot to kill him. What about us? Is Jesus our King? Is he our Messiah? How should we respond? Something to think about while Vic comes and closes us out, right?